IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host, Rakshith Shetty, a research analyst at Takshashila Institution, and today we are going to talk about China's space program. To talk about this issue today, I have Dr. Gunjan Singh on this show. Dr. Gunjan is an assistant professor at OP Jindal Global University. She previously worked with Indian Council of World Affairs and the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. She also co-edited the book Space Security and Global Cooperation. Welcome, Dr. Gunjan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks to Rakshith and thanks to Takshila for providing me this opportunity to discuss this topic. Pretty pertinent, I know. And let's hope that we're able to generate some interest in it going ahead.
So China's 2013 Science of Military Strategy anticipated that future wars will begin in space and cyberspace, arguing that, quote, seizing command of space and network dominance will become crucial for obtaining comprehensive superiority on the battlefield and conquering an enemy, unquote. Now, the roots of China's space ambitions go back to 1957, when the Soviet Union successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite, that is Sputnik 1, into space. And that year, Chairman Mao Zedong declared China would also launch its own satellite. And with the help of Soviet technology and scientists such as Qian Xuesen, who studied and initially worked in the United States, but was deported for allegedly being a communist sympathiser, the country established its space program. And on July 1964, China took its official first step into space, launching and recovering an experimental biological rocket carrying white mice. Super interesting. Dr. Gunjan, how has China's space program evolved over the years, and what significant milestones have been achieved to date?
Okay, as you mentioned correctly, like China has been aspirational towards space since 1950s, late 1950s. Now, the space program initially did begin as a civilian program. However, as we will go and discuss further as well, that now it is absolutely military focused. The military has a major say in how the Chinese program will venture out. Not saying that they don't have a lot of civilian programs and have not done enough for the civilian aspects of it. So the space program initially began officially in 1964 and has actually largely evolved secretly under the joint command of the Chinese military and the Commission of Science, Technology and Industry of National Defense. Chinese government founded the China National Space Administration in 1993. They have 3 launch facilities in the provinces of Gansu, Shaanxi, and Sichuan. And their launching platform, the Long March, which they call, has been quite successful. I think last year they successfully launched about 41 satellites to space. Chinese space flight program was developed in 1992 with the aim of a human space flight. CNSA has also launched its first as Chinese call the astronauts, the iconauts, in space in October 2003. Now, this has actually made China only the 3rd country to be able to achieve the most of these missions. China has also done a successful ASAT. They have done space flight. They've already done achieve the moon mission. They have done successful spacewalk. They have a fully functioning space station. Last year, they also managed to bring back the three of their astronauts who were at the space station, and they're actually planning to have the first launch of them or have a man on moon by 2013. So, and they also have, they've done the unmanned docking of the space station, have a successfully working navigation satellite system known as the Baidu satellite systems, which actually can be seen as an alternative to the existing global positioning system and the Galileo operating systems. That's all they've done. They're just the third country in the world today to have achieved most of these parameters after the US and the USSR, and now the Soviet Russia.
And Professor, do they have, in their white papers, have they ever mentioned that what are the goals of China's space program?
Yeah, the white papers are pretty detailed. Chinese have released quite a few white papers on space. And the last one actually gives you good details of what they want to achieve and where they see their space program going ahead. The last white paper on space was released in 2002. Now, China has released white papers in 2000, especially focused on space in 2000, 2006, 2011, and 2016. They actually talk about in the 2022 white paper of the successful completion of the Baidu navigation system. It also talks about improving space infrastructure, integrated remote sensing, and communication navigation. It also talks about the launch of the manned space flight project to have astronauts in space for longer time, and so that they can actually conduct experiments there. Now, human lunar landing is one of their programs mentioned in the latest white paper. They also talk about deep space explorations. They also talk about cislunar space. Now, the cislunar space, I did a little bit of reading on it also, is a space which lies between the Earth and the Moon orbit. So this space is currently actually unexplored and underutilized. So that's one of the goals or directions in which the Chinese space program will go.
Mm-hmm. And could you please provide an overview of Tiangong space station and its role in China's space exploration ambitions?
Yes, the Chinese space station, which is Tiangong, which actually translates into heavenly kingdom in English, is operated by the Chinese manned space agency. It was fully completed and became operational in November 2022. Also, Chinese have done this because, as we know, the China is excluded from the International Space Station, which is operated by NASA and the US.
Mm-hmm.
So Tiangong is also a much smaller space station. It has just about 3 modules compared to the ISS having 16. Tiangong also just weighs about 77 tons and is 180 feet. So there's a 2011 decree, like the Wolf Amendment, which actually prohibits NASA or any government-funded body in the United States from engaging or cooperating with the Chinese in any matter space. That also comes from the fear of space technologies going to the US from China, or also the second was the human rights violations in China. So given that, the Chinese have gone ahead and actually build their own space station, and it's fully functional. So as I said, last year they actually brought back about 3 of their taikonauts from there. They're planning to have taikonauts stay there for longer periods of time so that they can actually conduct some experiments. They've done successful spacewalk, and they've said that it's open for anybody who wants to cooperate, and they're ready to cooperate with any other country who wants to visit the Chinese space station.
Professor, you mentioned Wolf Amendment. Could you please explain us what it is and what was the rationale behind its implementation? And was it considered a mistake? And because there were subsequent negotiations involving this with the US and with China also regarding space collaboration. So was it a mistake, or what does US feel about Wolf Amendment as of date?
The Wolf Amendment, as we just mentioned, is a law passed by the US Congress in 2011. It is named after the US Representative Frank Wolf, who pushed or rallied behind it. This actually prohibits the United States, any United States body which is government funded, as well as NASA, obviously, from using government funds to engage in direct bilateral cooperation with the Chinese government, and thus obviously restricts any kind of collaboration between the Chinese and the Americans, especially in the space arena. The arguments given were obviously the spying and the fact that technology will move from the US to the Chinese technology or the space program. Americans were a little ahead at that time. So obviously the fear that the Chinese are going to bridge the gap sooner, which they have managed to do anyways. But also the human rights violations in China. So they said that the Chinese government agencies cannot cooperate with the American agencies cannot cooperate with the Chinese. But there has been some calls for repelling because I think the Chinese have managed to get moon rock in 2020 back to Earth. And the NASA scientists are actually arguing that they should get access to it and they should be able to study it as well. But this is the scientific lobbying happening. But if you look at the political discourse, the way the Chinese and American politics is going, the bilateral relations are going, I don't see the Wolf Amendment getting repelled or even reduced or how should I say, weakened in any form, because the fear of technology transfer is actually real. We see that happening in other segments as well. So the Wolf Amendment, I think, will continue. I don't think so officially it's going to be stopped. But if I have to get a little creative and predict, I think the Wolf Amendment actually talks about the government-funded bodies, right? So I don't know how the private sector in the US is actually going to work around it.
Right. I mean, the reason for asking this question was because, I mean, the US owns more than half of the satellites,
Yes.
if I'm not wrong. They have more powerful rockets and which carry more payloads. They have more
Yes.
space funding and a booming commercial space industry and more private players also. I mean,
Yes.
the entire notion of US-China space race, I mean, many observers believe that it's a myth because they believe that the alarm is associated with falling behind the space race is invariably paired with calls for US to spend more on new space military capabilities, space exploration, and the commercial space industry. Do you think that US-China space race is a myth or is it a real thing?
See, the China-US space race is, I don't know if I should call it a myth, but it may become a reality very soon. Right now, obviously, the Chinese budget is about 13 billion, right? The American budget is, I think, if I'll have to check it out, but it's definitely above about $45 billion, right? Just for space. NASA has already conducted most of the experiments which the Chinese are just getting at. But the Chinese surprisingly have bridged the gap very fast. They did the ASAT test pretty quickly. They've done the space station, functioning space station. They're actually working on reusable vehicles to get back to Earth and reuse them. Americans have already managed to have a successful test in that direction. But the Chinese also saying they will go ahead and actually start working on it. They're saying they're going to put a man on moon by 2030. The Americans also are actually talking about doing it by 2025 again. Chinese are actually talking about the polar explorations of moon, which the Americans also want to do. So but obviously, if you look at the budget, the size, the fact that obviously Americans own more than, I think, out of 3,300 satellites belong to the US, and Chinese are a very minuscule number there. But the Baidu system, the way Chinese have made it operational, can become a challenge. Like they can actually blind the American GPS satellites, and obviously every navigation on ground can be disrupted or blinded for a very long time. Given all of that, I think the space race may become real because the Chinese government has been consistent about its approach towards having a space technology. Now, space technology is also essential, right? They have the spin-offs. They better the betterment of the life, or disaster management, predicting fires, navigation, your telecommunication, your satellite TV. So they have very big and very essential and crucial civilian spin-offs as well. So given that the Chinese government has been consistent, has achieved a lot in a very short period of time, and is consistent, the white papers show that they are focused towards it. And this year, I think China aims to launch about 100 satellites. Though the Americans have had a lot of success in launching as well, but the Long March platform, the launching platform, is one of the most successful in the world. And it is a government-owned launching platform, right? The American platform is still, most of the launches are done by private sector. So given the fact that space has been associated with the next big step, it's directly under Xi Jinping, is linked to national rejuvenation and China's rise and other fact, a space race may become real. And the Artemis Accord that the Americans have talked about is actually can become a little complicated going ahead. So let's see. But if there's no space race today, I don't know how it's going to be in 2030.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Let's come to India. What do you think, Dr. Gunjan? In what ways does China's space program differ that from India, particularly in the terms of maybe government funding, commercial ventures, private players, research and development, and public perception?
So, Rakshith, the Indian space program, as we know, we've learned it consistently, the civilian space program. The military doesn't have much say there. It's consistently been a civilian program. It is held by the ISRO, which is independent body to the government. Also, Chinese space program has a strong military component. Also, the budget-wise, Chinese space program is about $13 billion, as we just said. India is 1.6. So the number actually gives us a clear indication about the gap where we are. As we know, most, not all our Chandrayaan missions have been smaller and cheaper. Obviously, they've been successful, but India has also shown that you can have cheaper space missions which can be successful and do the job. So India, I think, became the fourth country to have a successful moon mission and the first to actually get to the south pole of the moon, as far as I remember. Also, as we've discussed, the Chinese space program, Indian space program also began in around 1960s, but the momentum began in the 70s and the 80s. ISRO today obviously launches, builds, operates, tracks a number of satellites. We have undertaken a very successful Mars mission, I think called the Mangalyaan orbiter. India is also planning to launch another mission to Mars and a solar observatory called the Aditya L1. Indian space program also works on a very tight and limited budget, but it actually managed to achieve a lot of success and is a credible. India can be called as a credible space power. Indian space economy, if we go in a little bit of detail, is about $8 billion, the overall economy around space. And I think there are also talks that they want to raise it to about $100 billion by 2040. Indian space launching space platform, the PSLV, is also a very successful, internationally reputed launching space vehicle. India has about, I think, 200 private space startups as far as the 2023 figures, and about 1,000 crores invested there. And under the current government, we've actually seen a rise of about 140% in the space budget. So again, repeating myself, Indian space missions have been cost effective and successful, and actually have been very efficient in disaster management, managing or building of railways, highways, helping in agriculture, as well as robotic surgery.
In the last answer, you mentioned that there's a military aspect to China's space program, with
Yes.
the majority of China's space activities managed by the China National Space Administration and the PLA, which is People Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. Which institution do you think primarily oversees the nation's space programs? And is there an angle of civil-military fusion that you just mentioned? And then what does basically China's dual, for all the listeners who are not from our backgrounds, what does China's dual space technology mean, and why is it cynically viewed by some observers? And how does it compare to similar practices in other countries?
Okay, coming to your last point, see, dual use, as I said, India also uses dual use, right? Like when I was starting reading on space, I figured that if you have successful space program, you have better tennis rackets. Now, this is a big difference, right? Like space technology connected to what kind of rackets are available to your sports player domestically, because most of these technologies come under, there's a lot of regimes that prevent technology transfer, right? India has been under a lot of limitations on buying or getting access to international, most of the technologies. So successful launch actually helped you bridge that gap. It's a domestic, it's indigenous. So it helps you in overall growth, like cell phones, televisions, your disaster management, fire prediction, movement, reconnaissance. So everything is related to space today, right? The movement of your military on ground, it can be guided by space and satellites, right? Like it helps. It makes your warfare technology, reconnaissance, border management, everything so much better. So given that space has dual use, right? Any one technology, as we have understood, can be used for other means as well. So you cannot say that space can only be used for one way. Space technologies actually help for other aspects as well. Now, China becomes an interesting case study because if we look at sitting in India, we have a lot of mistrust, right? We have the border issue. We have had a lot of challenges in negotiating and understanding. China is one of our largest neighbors, which has with which we don't have very good relations. And space technology, China is actually focused towards the US. They are trying to bridge that gap, obviously. So the way the international order is, the way China has used the technology, which in a realist paradigm I'll say any country would do, is actually to expand a lot of its military and aggressive posturing as well, right? It provides them that leverage to go ahead and do that. The talk about Baidu is always that what if they block or blind the GPS satellites, right? We don't have that kind of fear towards the global positioning system. Like any space debate doesn't go around the fact that what if the Americans stop giving you access to it? So there's also a perceptional thing. I'm not saying Chinese are benign, but the thing is, obviously the debate is around the fact that what if? What if China decides to militarize its space capabilities? And militarization of space capability is like a turn of switch, like an ASAT is more. They can actually target one of your most important prominence recognized satellites, which can actually, if there's a conflict brewing up, can blind you on your borders overnight. And it's not an easy thing to replace. So the fact is they have the capability. Now the question is intention. Now, till date, Chinese have constantly been saying peaceful use, cooperation, and stuff like that. But obviously, in a case of conflict, we don't know how they're going to go ahead.
Do they actually sell these space technologies to other countries? And if other countries do actually buy them, I mean, why do they prefer Chinese space technologies over the Western?
That's a very interesting question. I got a list of things that China has done from their white paper for other countries. China has actually become one of the most biggest or largest exporter of space technology since 1990s. The Baidu system, all BRI countries have access to it. On a shorter note, the Baidu, I just read somewhere, if you remember the star, which is navigation, it's called Big Dipper, right? Which we use to, if that translates into Baidu in Chinese, by the way. So they've named their whole reconnaissance system, the navigation system on that. Also, the Baidu has a large, significant user base. To about 6.2 million vehicles in China are plugged into the Baidu system. This is also a system which China is keen and ready to give access to every BRI member. China has also launched satellites for Pakistan, Venezuela, Sudan. It has actually undertaken launching services for Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, and Luxembourg. It has conducted space product and technology cooperation with Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Argentina, Pakistan, and Nigeria. It has also said that under the BRI, the space facilities are open for all developing countries. It has built satellite data receiving stations for countries like Indonesia, Bolivia, Namibia, Thailand, South Africa. And under the BRICS, it has signed a remote sensing satellite constellation, which it operates in cooperation with the European Space Agency. And it has a similar program under the ASEAN as well. It also has a Lansang Mekong Space Information Exchange Center. which is with Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So if you look the thing, China actually has helped a lot of countries to launch satellites and get into the space technologies, right? This is because the Chinese space program is a government program. They can use it for their soft power. They can use it primarily to build relations. They can actually offer it under the BRI, because the BRI is a government program. The space is a government undertaking. Now, if you look at the American system, it's more of a private thing, right? There's a lot of politics, like they don't cooperate with the Chinese, first of all. So I don't think so they're going to cooperate with any country that is cooperating with China there. Plus, most of the launching is done under private vehicles. So obviously the costs are higher. The Chinese can go ahead and do it because they have some, like they have friendship with Pakistan, they have a friendship with other nations, and they can do it for that. And it also builds their reliability and their status as a space power. So it helps them in their soft power building as well.
Professor, when you mentioned they're offering these technologies under the BRI program, you meant that it was under BRI Space Information Corridor, right? When
Yes,
it's the same thing,
yes.
right? Space Silk Road or this BRI
Yes,
program?
yes. It is under the Space Silk Route and the communication thing, which is primarily the Baidu system that we are talking about.
Oh, okay, cool. You were just talking about how it can potentially weaponize its anti-satellite weapons against its aggressors. I mean, whoever it has conflict with, right? Do you
Yes.
believe there is a need for additional international space laws and treaties, especially concerning issues like anti-satellite weapon testing? And before that, could you also tell us briefly, like how many treaties currently govern outer space activities?
Okay. As of now, there are 5 treaties which govern the outer space or the space programs and space technologies. The first is the Outer Space Treaty, which actually entered into force in 1967. Sorry. The second is the Rescue Agreement, which is basically about the astronauts and if there's a problem, how to rescue them, which entered into force in 1968. The third is the Liability Convention, which is basically about damaging of space objects, which entered into force in 1972. The fourth is the Registration Convention, which entered into force in 76. And the fifth is the Moon Agreement, which entered into force in 1984. Now, out of these two, the most prominent ones right now, the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement, or the Moon Treaty, as people call them. Now, the Outer Space Treaty basically argues that every state, every sovereign state has access to space. Like they shouldn't be prevented from exploring and launching satellites and using it for their own developmental purposes. But it also says that space cannot be used for weaponization. Like you cannot weaponize the space. It's a common space. Every country should have equal access to it. Now, on the other hand, the Moon Agreement actually says that the moon is a common body and it's a common resource, and every country should have access to moon for peaceful and developmental purposes. Now, given these two, the Outer Space Treaty technically has been very successful, I'll say, because there's been no outright weaponization of space yet. Countries have refrained from it. But the problem is enforcement of these treaties, right? If we say we cannot weaponize space, then the question of your missile defense comes into picture, right? Because it's the ICBMs and all use the same trajectory. Now, if you have an anti-ballistic technology, which is basically preventing from any missiles or ballistic missiles from entering your airspace, you will counter them in the outer space, right? That's how the anti-ballistic missile technology works. Now, if you become a signatory full and firm and say that we're going to talk about no weaponization or using of space for military purposes primarily, then your anti-ballistic missiles technology has no teeth because you cannot counter the launches. So given that space is a multi-layered thing, your ground positioning, your ground capabilities are directly related to how you operate in space, it becomes a little difficult for having them implemented. So, and the ASAT tests are very interesting because they lead to a lot of debris. More than technology display, the satellite which is killed, the debris actually floats in the space. Now, the chances are it might affect other satellites, right? It might get into their path, it might derail them, it might affect them, it might harm a working satellite. So obviously there is a need for more, the way technology is growing, there's a need for more treaties which have more teeth and more implementation. But the tragedy with space is, as I argue, that what you do in space affects your ground reality. So people say they don't want militarization. Every country says they will not weaponize. Every country signs the treaties that there will be no nuclear weapons in space. However, the fact that when you're talking about an ICBM, when you're talking about launching of a missile, launching of any kind of a weapon on ground, they enter space and then get back to Earth. So what about that? So most of the countries will refrain because obviously anti-ballistic missile technologies are most coveted, right? It is your first round of defense against any kind of threat that can come from anywhere.
Looking ahead, what are some of the key developments or initiatives we can expect from China's space program, and how might they impact international space exploration efforts?
See, Chinese space program is going to get stronger. They are consistently working on it. They have white papers. Anybody who's interested can actually read the white papers. And while I was reading the 2002 white paper, I figured out most of the things they've talked about that they will do it in next 5 years, they've already achieved. So they're consistent. The white papers give us a clear guideline where they're going to go. They're actually talking about the reusable vehicles and stuff, which actually gives China a leg up. It'll actually become better. The Long March platforms, they've consistently improved on them. They will consistently keep improving on them. And it's one of the most successful launch vehicles. 2024, as I was discussing, China is saying it's going to launch 100, have 100 launches and more than 300 spacecraft into orbit by 2024, which is actually a very sharp increase from last year. And also we have to keep in mind the commercial component, right? As we said, the space industry is a big market. The launch is if you have a successful launch vehicle, it actually means a lot of money. Otherwise, we would have not had private players getting into it. It actually calls for a more profitable system. So Chinese also want to, if you look at from non-military point of view, the Chinese also want to have access to this market, right? They will want to make money out of it. And they have successfully developed. They will successfully go on developing. Given that they will be one of the most, they are one of the most successful launch platforms, and they will continue to encash on that.
I think over the next 15 years, China intends to continue its momentum in space, as you said, exploration, with a focus on more lunar and planetary missions. Now, These plans include launching Chang'e 6, 7, and 8 missions for lunar exploration, and also establishing the International Lunar Research Station with international collaboration, maybe, and aiming for a man-moon landing around 2030, which you mentioned.
2030, yes.
Right. And China also aims to advance its space technological capabilities, including developing a new super heavy lift rocket capable of sending a payload of 150 tons to near Earth orbit. So it's really an exciting space to watch. And thank you so much, Dr. Gunjan, for sharing your insights and taking the time to be here with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you. Very good questions, and I hope I managed to answer your questions.
No, you were brilliant insights. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and see you all in the next episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.